Welcome everyone. Today finds me in Chicago, Illinois, where we're going to look at some of this city's most famous gangsters. We're starting our tour at Mount Carmel Catholic Cemetery, where some of the most famous mobsters in Chicago history are buried. Throughout our tour, we're going to be bouncing back and forth between the resting places of these famous gangsters and the houses in which many of them lived. Without a doubt, Al Capone is the most famous mobster in this cemetery and possibly the most famous in Chicago history. For a while, Al Capone was almost seen like a folk hero, like a modern-day Robin Hood. In fact, people used to applaud and cheer for him when he arrived at public events such as ball games. However, that all started to change, particularly with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. People started to realize this is more than just a guy sneaking alcohol into speakeasies. This was a cold-blooded murderer. And since I came here, a cigar, a quarter, and a shell casing has been left on his grave marker. Ralph Bottles Capone was an interesting character. At one point, he was public enemy number 3 on the FBI list, right behind his brother, who was public enemy number 1. Bottles didn't get his name from his brother's bootlegging business. He got it because he actually worked for a bottling company. However, he was involved in organized crime, and he was also indicted for tax evasion, just like his brother, and went to prison. However, after that, his power in the mob started to wane, and he was more a figurehead. He was more known because he had the Capone name. Interestingly enough, a lot of those gangsters used to hang out in northern Wisconsin because they were far away from the long arm of the law, the Chicago law anyway, and it was kind of secluded up there, and the Capones both owned homes. Well, Ralph eventually retired to Mercer, Wisconsin, where for 2.5 decades he actually ran a bar and was a regular citizen until he died in 1974. Eventually, his granddaughter brought his remains down here to join the rest of the family. And right there where that man is kneeling down is Al Capone's gravesite. And not too far, exactly where I'm standing, is the resting place of his second command, Frank Nitti. Of course, here it lists him as Frank Nito, which was his real Sicilian name, but this is mob boss Frank Nitti. Capone and Nitti were both convicted of tax evasion and went to prison. Upon his release in 1932, Frank Nitti took over the Chicago mob. This unassuming house was the home of Frank Nitti, and despite a famous scene from the Kevin Costner movie The Untouchables, Eliot Ness did not throw Frank Nitti off a roof. In fact, from the time he was released from prison in 1932 until his death by suicide in 1943, he ran the Chicago mob, and this is where Frank Nitti lived. In 1943, members of the mob were indicted for extortion. They were extorting money from major Hollywood studios. They controlled the union, and they said there would be a lot of trouble for the studios if they didn't pay up. Well, the studios did pay, but nevertheless, major mob figures were indicted. Among those were Frank Nitti and Paul Ricca. Nitti never did well in prison. He was very claustrophobic, and faced with prison, he decided instead to take his own life. So on March 19, 1943, Frank Nitti had his final breakfast in this house. He said goodbye to his wife, took his .32 caliber handgun, and proceeded to get drunk. Then he walked the 5 blocks to a local train yard and committed suicide. He was 57 years old. This is one of 2 homes we're going to look at where Paul the Waiter Ricca lived. Now, a lot of people may not remember him, but he was associated with the Chicago mob for a long, long time. From the year 1931, when Al Capone was put in prison, till 1932, when Frank Nitti was released, Paul Ricca was the acting head of the Chicago Syndicate. And he lived right here. This is the other home of Paul Ricca. In 1943, after the suicide death of Frank Nitti, he took over the mob. And with his second in command, Tony Accardo, also known as Big Tuna, they ran the mob until the 1970s. And this is where Ricca lived. And this was a house of Sam Giancana. He was a boss of the Chicago mob from 1957 to 1966. He was anointed the new boss when Accardo resigned to become consigliere. Although it was pretty much understood that Sam was more of a figurehead, although he was a colorful character. Sam was having an affair with Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire sisters. In fact, he was introduced to her by none other than Frank Sinatra. And it's said that the Rat Pack and Giancana had a pretty close relationship. And you know what? Phyllis McGuire is still alive. It's said that Sam played a crucial role in JFK winning the presidency. It's also been said that Giancana met with the CIA in order to hatch a plan to assassinate Cuba's Fidel Castro. This is not only where Giancana lived, but it's where he died. On the night of June 19, 1975, a gunman entered this house and shot Giancana in the back. After he fell to the floor, the gunman turned him over and shot him 6 more times in the face and the neck. Giancana was brutally gunned down in the basement of his own home. According to some, he was just bringing too much unwanted attention to the Chicago mob. According to one mafia member, Salvatore Bastone, there's never just one reason for what happened to Sam. There's a million of them. Let's just say Sam should have remembered what happened to Bugsy Siegel. And although this is a video about mobsters and gangsters and criminals, not everybody buried here, of course, has ties to crime. In fact, here's one famous person that you probably recognize, actor Dennis Farina. Among other things, Farina was a Chicago cop for 18 years, and he starred in such TV shows as Law & Order and Crime Story. Quite an unassuming resting place. I almost couldn't find the marker because it was covered in grass clippings, and I had to brush them away in order to read the name. And this is certainly an interesting monument. It's the final resting place of Irish bootlegger Dean O'Banion. As per an agreement with many of the Chicago bootleggers, O'Banion was supposed to be in control of the north side. And among those that were part of the agreement was none other than Al Capone. While O'Banion really didn't want to stay in the north side as agreed upon, he wanted to work his way into other parts of Chicago, and specifically members of the Geno crime family wanted to put out a hit on him. But Mike Merlo refused to sanction a hit. But then, in 1924, Mike Merlo died and things changed. O'Banion worked in a flower shop, and under the guise of getting flowers for Merlo's funeral, O'Banion was assassinated. A Brooklyn gangster named Frankie Yale and 2 Jenna gunmen went in to make the floral arrangements. The story always says that O'Banion was clipping chrysanthemums. I don't know why that's important, but it's become mob history and mob lore. He reached out to shake Yale's hand, and Yale grabbed it firmly and held on tight as the other 2 men fired 4 shots into O'Banion, 2 into his chest and 2 into his neck. It's rather interesting that a lot of these men who spent their whole lives fighting one another all ended up in the same cemetery. And speaking of the North Side Gang, here's the resting place of Hymie Weiss. Weiss was said to be the only man that Al Capone feared. A group of news photographers once approached him, and he glared at them and snarled, "If you take a picture of me, I'll kill you." That's the kind of guy he was. Interestingly enough, he was gunned down by Tommy guns, machine guns, outside the very flower shop where Dean O'Banion was killed. And that is notable because Dean O'Banion was said to be the first mobster to bring machine guns to the city of Chicago, although he was killed before he could actually use one. I hope you enjoyed our visit with some of Chicago's most famous gangland figures. You know, crime doesn't pay. You're always going to end up here. As always, I encourage you to like and share the videos. If you're not already subscribed, please click my face down there in the corner and ring that bell icon up above so you know when I post new videos. From Chicago, Illinois, I'm Mark with the Average Me channel.